The archives were never truly silent. Even in the dead of night, with the street lamps casting long bars of yellow light through the high windows, there was a hush filled with the sound of settling wood, the faint scrape of paper shifting in drawers, and the sigh of a building that had stood for 300 years. Evelyn Hart preferred these hours, when the day's bustle faded and the reading rooms emptied, leaving her alone with the shelves. She moved between them like a shadow, her fingertips trailing along leather bindings so fragile they might crumble if touched without reverence. She had been cataloguing a batch of miscellaneous donations when her hand fell on a narrow, dust-caked bundle bound with faded twine. No label, no protective slip, just parchment edges peeking from between two warped boards. She laid it gently on the desk under the cone of lamplight. The air around it carried a scent of salt and something older. Wood smoke, perhaps, or the faint tang of iron. When she untied the twine, a manuscript unfolded, its pages crackling faintly. The ink had browned to the shade of old tea, the script jagged and unfamiliar to most eyes. But Evelyn's pulse quickened. She recognized the Norse hand, the distinctive loops and angles. Across the margins, strange marks repeated. Not letters, not ornament, but deliberate shapes, slashes, dots, spirals that seemed to march in sequences. She leaned closer, her breath catching. This was no random scribble from a bored scribe. Each mark was precise, placed at intervals that hinted at intention. She reached for her magnifying glass, tracing the series with a gloved finger. Some appeared near place names, others beside numbers in the text. The more she looked, the more her mind began to hum, with the same quiet thrill that had carried her through countless solitary nights of study. Somewhere in these pages, a message had been left. It felt alive, waiting. The next morning in the staff lounge, she carried the manuscript to Dr. Roland Mercer, the archive's senior historian. He barely glanced at it before smirking. "Viking voyage log, 15th copy I've seen," he said, sipping his coffee. "And these?" she pressed, pointing to the symbols. "Decoration, or a drunk clerk's doodles. Don't waste your time, Miss Hart." He handed it back as though it were little more than a placemat. Evelyn kept her expression still, but inside his words struck that familiar chord, the one that had driven her since her first year in the archives, when a professor told her she'd do well to stay in the background. She had made a quiet career out of staying in the background and finding what others missed. Back at her desk, she slipped on her gloves again. The symbols weren't decoration, they were a trail. She could feel it in her bones. As midnight came, the lamps burning low, she copied them onto fresh parchment. Lines connected in her mind. Shapes began to shift into meaning. She imagined the scribe, centuries ago, bent over these very lines by firelight, his breath misting in the cold, slipping a secret between the lines for only the worthy to find. Somewhere far to the north, waves broke against an unseen shore, and the wind howled over something buried deep in the earth. She didn't know why she thought it, but she was certain. This was not just a manuscript. It was a map. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, her voice whispered in her own mind, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Dr. Roland Mercer's life. Her pen hovered over the page, and the first fragment of the code took shape beneath her hand. Somewhere, a journey had begun. By the following afternoon, the archives bustled with their usual chorus, squeaks of rolling ladders, the hollow thump of heavy tomes being set down, and the low murmur of researchers buried in their work. Evelyn sat at her station, the Viking manuscript safely cradled in a padded folder. Her eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, but her mind was sharper than it had been in years. She'd spent half the night copying the strange markings, arranging them, rearranging them until certain sequences began to take shape. When she spotted Dr. Mercer passing through the reading room, she rose, folder in hand. "Dr. Mercer," she called softly, careful not to disturb the others. "I think there's more to this manuscript than you realized," he turned, brows lifting in polite annoyance. "Miss Hart, I'm late for a meeting." She opened the folder, just enough for him to see her neatly inked copies of the symbols laid out beside the original page. These recur in a very deliberate order. I believe they correspond to navigational points, latitude and longitude in a proto-form, perhaps. His laugh was a short, sharp thing. "You've been staring at ink blots too long. Do you know how many enthusiasts come to me with hidden codes they've discovered? 99 times out of 100 it's a coincidence. The other 1% is still worthless." The words stung more than she wanted to admit, and she felt heat crawl up her neck. "I'm not an enthusiast," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm an archivist. This is my work." Dr. Mercer's gaze softened for just a heartbeat, perhaps pity, perhaps irritation. "Miss Hart, you're very good at preserving the past, but deciphering it, that's the historian's job. Leave it with me if you must, but I doubt I'll find anything worth my time." He reached for the manuscript, but Evelyn stepped back, clutching it protectively. Something inside her recoiled at the thought of it vanishing into his office. "No," she said, surprising them both. "I'll hold on to it for now." Mercer's lips tightened. "As you wish. But don't say I didn't warn you when it leads nowhere." She watched him walk away, his figure framed by the shelves, the faint echo of his dismissive laugh lingering in her ears. That sound, the sound of someone certain they knew better, had followed her most of her life. She'd learned to live with it, even let it shape her. But this time, the condescension only deepened her resolve. Later that evening, as the building emptied, Evelyn spread her notes across a long oak table in the dim research room. The rhythmic clunk of the old radiator was her only company. She thought of Mercer's expression, the easy dismissal, and felt something almost electric course through her. In her mind's eye, the unknown scribe from centuries ago was watching her, testing her. The symbols were a lock, and she was inches from turning the key. She leaned over the parchment, following the markings with her fingertip, whispering the Norse words they neighbored. Vesta. Storm. Huff. West. Storm. Sea. It was a breadcrumb trail, written by someone who had dared to go beyond the edge of any map they knew. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her smiled. Mercer could scoff all he liked, but she would follow the trail. The nights grew longer, and with them, Evelyn's obsession deepened. The manuscript never left her sight, tucked carefully into a reinforced satchel when she left the archives. Locked away in a fireproof box in her apartment. Her dining table had vanished beneath layers of tracing paper, lexicons and photocopies of Norse maps. The air scented faintly with the tang of old ink and the ever-present bitterness of her coffee. She began to notice something new in the markings. Not just repetition, but rhythm. A symbol shaped like a fishhook always followed a swirl that resembled a breaking wave. A triangle appeared in sequences near words for fjord or cliff. She'd draw them again and again until the shapes began to connect in her mind like waypoints. By the third week, she was certain this was navigational code. The Vikings had been master sailors. But this was unlike anything she'd seen in existing records. They hadn't just mapped known routes. They had recorded a path far beyond the familiar coasts of Scandinavia. One rainy Thursday evening, she leaned back from the table, rubbing her eyes. Across the room, the sound of the storm outside blended with the faint tick of her clock. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift. Imagining a carved wooden longship cutting across black waves, sails swollen with wind, the crew shouting in a language lost to most ears, she could almost feel the salt on her face. When she opened her eyes, she saw it. The markings, rearranged just slightly, aligned perfectly with a fragment of a 12th century star chart she'd seen in the Archives astronomy collection. Her hands trembled as she overlaid the two images. The result was clear. The code pointed to a route that crossed into the mid-Atlantic, far beyond Iceland and Greenland. Her breath quickened. This wasn't just a deviation from known history. It was a challenge to it. If the Vikings had made this journey, where had they gone? And why had this route been hidden, embedded in a manuscript no one thought twice about? The thought of Mercer's smug smile made her jaw tighten. She could almost hear him saying, "Coincidence." But every instinct in her said otherwise. She stayed late at the archive the next day, scanning more pages for comparison. In the dim aisles between shelves, she caught sight of movement, a flicker of shadow that vanished when she turned. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she gathered her notes, she heard it. Soft footsteps, deliberate, keeping pace with her own. She spun around, but the corridor was empty, the silence absolute. Evelyn clutched her satchel tighter. If someone else had noticed her work, it meant she was getting close, very close, and the closer she got, the more certain she became. This code wasn't meant for everyone. It had been hidden for a reason. The next morning, the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. Evelyn tried to dismiss it as paranoia born from too many late nights alone with the manuscript, but the unease settled into her bones. Every creak of the archive's floorboards seemed sharper. Every cough from another room made her glance over her shoulder. That afternoon, while she was transferring her latest notes into the digital database, a man she didn't recognize appeared in the reading room. He was tall, with a narrow face and a black overcoat, despite the mild weather outside. His eyes scanned the tables before settling on her with a kind of cool calculation. He approached without a word, stopping just close enough that she could smell the faint scent of leather and rain on him. "You're Evelyn Hart," he said, not asking. Her fingers froze on the keyboard. "Yes, can I help you?" "I'm Dr. Nathan Cole. I work on Norse maritime records at the university. I hear you've been spending a great deal of time on a certain manuscript." The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. "It's part of my duties here. I'd like to examine it." His tone carried the certainty of someone used to getting his way. Evelyn's mind flashed to the flicker of movement she'd seen between the stacks 2 nights ago. She straightened, closing her laptop. "I'm afraid the manuscript isn't available without proper clearance." Something passed over his expression. Not anger, but a faint smirk, as if he knew she was lying. "Clearance can be arranged," he said quietly. "In the meantime, I'll be back tomorrow." He turned and left without another word, the click of his heels echoing through the vaulted room. That evening, as she locked the manuscript in the archive's secure cabinet, she found an unsigned request form already sitting on her desk. It bore the manuscript's catalogue number and a single scrawled note. "You don't know what you have." Her pulse quickened. She tucked the paper into her bag and hurried out into the night. The rain-slick streets glistened under the lamplight, but she felt no comfort in their familiar glow. Back in her apartment, she paced the living room. If Cole was after the manuscript, then perhaps Mercer had spoken to him, or worse, someone else entirely had caught wind of what she was uncovering. The idea of the code falling into the wrong hands gnawed at her. Her gaze fell to her work table, where the copied symbols lay scattered like puzzle pieces. She shuffled them, tracing the route again with her finger. Every time she did, her conviction grew stronger. The destination lay somewhere uncharted, guarded by centuries of secrecy. For the first time, she realized just how dangerous that secrecy might be. If she was right, this wasn't simply a matter of academic glory. There might be more at stake than she could yet imagine, and somewhere in the shadows of the archive, she suspected, someone was already planning to take it from her. By the time the archive opened the next morning, Evelyn had already been awake for hours. The rain from the night before had given way to a pale, cold sunlight that poured through the high windows, casting long shadows over the reading room. She ignored the routine chatter of staff, keeping her focus locked on the manuscript in front of her. Today she was determined to finish the translation of the final sequence. The symbols she'd been laboring over formed a winding line across the parchment, punctuated by recurring marks she now understood as directional cues. One set of symbols, positioned near the word half, sea, matched perfectly with a particular cluster of islands off the coast of Greenland. But the path didn't end there. It extended into what was, on all modern charts, nothing but empty water. Her hands shook as she overlaid her tracing onto a current nautical map. The two paths merged almost seamlessly, until the coded route veered southwest, straight toward a patch of ocean no one had cause to visit. That's when she noticed it. The route ended in a small, perfectly round shape. Not an island on any modern record, but clearly marked on the ancient code. A forgotten island. She felt the air leave her lungs in a slow, steady exhale. Whoever had carved this path into the manuscript had wanted to ensure only the right eyes would ever find it. The room around her seemed to fade as she imagined the voyage. A longship cutting through icy waters, its crew braced against sleet and wind, guided by the stars, and a knowledge passed from one trusted navigator to another. The scribe's hand had captured more than a map. It was a testament to a journey they hadn't wanted the world to know. The sound of footsteps brought her back sharply. She looked up to see Dr. Nathan Cole standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on the open manuscript. "You're making progress," he said smoothly. "More than you probably should be doing alone." Evelyn closed the folder, her voice calm despite her tightening chest. "I told you, Dr. Cole, this material isn't open for external research." He smiled faintly, though it never reached his eyes. "Do you think you're the only one who's been chasing this code? There are people who've been searching for it far longer than you've been in these archives." She forced herself not to react, but his words lodged in her mind like a splinter. That night, she sat in her apartment, the coded map spread before her. There was no denying it now. She had the complete route, but Cole's warning, or was it a threat, replayed over and over. If the island was real, and if it truly held what she suspected, she couldn't hand it over to the Mercers or Coles of the world. She would have to see it for herself. Her eyes hardened. The next step wasn't in the archives. It was on the water. Evelyn knew asking for official funding was pointless. Mercer would never approve it. And even if he did, the university would smother the expedition under layers of bureaucracy and take the credit. She needed people she could trust, and she needed them quietly. Her first call was to Mara Jensen, an old friend from her undergrad days who now captained a modest research vessel out of Reykjavik. Mara had weathered storms in the North Sea and once sailed through drifting ice to photograph puffin colonies. She didn't scare easily. "An uncharted island?" Mara repeated over the crackle of the line. "You know how that sounds, don't you?" "I know," Evelyn said, lowering her voice even though her apartment was empty. "But I have a map, and I'm certain it's authentic. I can't tell you everything yet." "Not over the phone." There was a long pause, followed by a sigh. "Send me your coordinates. If this is real, I'll get us there." By the end of the week, Evelyn was on a flight to Iceland, the manuscript secured in a waterproof case in her carry-on. Mara met her at the harbour, the wind biting at their cheeks as gulls wheeled overhead. The Njord's Wake, Mara's ship, bobbed at the dock, sturdy, compact, and built for long hauls in harsh seas. The crew she'd assembled was small but capable. Jonas, a wiry fisherman with an encyclopedic knowledge of Atlantic currents, Leif, a geologist with a passion for Arctic exploration, and Sana, a quiet but razor-sharp archaeologist from Greenland whose eyes lit up when she heard Viking Manuscript. They departed under a bruised dawn sky, the shoreline shrinking into a dark line behind them. Evelyn stood at the bow, her gloved hands tight on the rail, the cold wind rushing past her. The weight of what she was doing pressed against her chest, part exhilaration, part dread. Days passed in a rhythm of watch shifts and chart readings. Evelyn spent hours in the cramped cabin with Mara, comparing the manuscript's coded route to their GPS coordinates. The farther they travelled, the more treacherous the weather became. Rolling swells battered the hull, and freezing spray coated the deck in slick ice. One night, as the ship pitched through a squall, Evelyn caught sight of a faint light in the distance, not a star, but something low on the horizon, blinking once before vanishing. She said nothing to the crew, but it gnawed at her. Out here, there were no lighthouses. By the morning of the fifth day, the sea began to change. The water deepened to an almost black blue, calmer than it should have been, as if they'd entered a vast, hidden bay. The GPS showed only open ocean, but ahead, through the lifting mist, the shadow of land began to take form. An island. The crew gathered at the rail, silent as it rose before them. Jagged cliffs crowned with wind-bent pines, gulls circling high above. Evelyn felt her pulse in her throat. After centuries of silence, the place had emerged from the fog like a ghost answering its name. They had found it. The Njord's Wake anchored in the lee of a cliff that rose sheer from the water, streaked with veins of black basalt. The air smelled of salt and pine resin, carried on a wind that whistled through unseen hollows. For a long moment, no one spoke, as if words might disturb whatever had been waiting here for centuries. Evelyn was the first to step into the dinghy. The sea was unnervingly still as they rowed toward a narrow strip of beach tucked between the cliffs. Pale sand crunched underfoot as they landed, and Sana knelt immediately to examine a scattering of stones, her eyes widening. These are shaped, she murmured, worked by human hands. They moved inland, pushing through low brush until they emerged into a clearing. The remains of timber structures stood there, weathered to silver by wind and time. The skeletal frames of longhouses, their outlines matching descriptions in Norse settlement records. Jonas whistled low under his breath. This isn't on any chart, no record, no fishing reports, nothing. Evelyn's gaze swept the ground, catching on something half buried beneath a mat of moss. She brushed it aside to reveal a carved stone, its surface etched with runes that seemed impossibly sharp, despite the centuries. Sana crouched beside her, tracing the lines. "It's a warning," she translated softly. "About what lies beyond the cliff." They followed a narrow path that wound along the cliff's base, the sea crashing far below. Eventually, the path ended at a wall of stone that looked solid, until Leif pressed his hand against it and felt the hollow echo. A moment later, they found a seam, and with a coordinated shove, a slab swung inward on ancient hinges, groaning like a waking giant. The air inside was cold and dry. Their headlamps swept over walls lined with carved panels depicting longships, storms and feasts, but also battles against faceless figures, their shapes strange and unsettling. At the chamber's center stood a stone chest bound in iron, its surface worn smooth by time. Evelyn's heart pounded as she knelt to examine the lock, a simple mechanism, corroded but intact. She worked it free with shaking hands. The lid creaked open. Gold gleamed in the beam of her light. Arm rings, goblets, brooches studded with amber. But it was the object beneath them that made her breath catch, a rune stone, its face carved with the same symbols from the manuscript. Sana read aloud, her voice hushed. "This is no king's hoard. It is an offering to guard a path to the world's edge, to keep it hidden from the greedy and the faithless." The weight of the words settled over them. This wasn't merely treasure, it was a trust left by the dead for the living. Evelyn felt a chill, unrelated to the cold. Behind them, somewhere deeper in the tunnel, a faint sound echoed. The crunch of footsteps on stone. The sound was faint at first. A scuff, a pause, then another step. But in the stillness of the chamber, it might as well have been a gunshot. Evelyn froze, her hand still resting on the edge of the stone chest. Mara swung her headlamp toward the tunnel's mouth, the beam catching only the ragged edges of rock. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. Dr. Nathan Cole. His overcoat was gone, replaced by a heavy oilskin jacket, but the same self-assured smirk curved his lips. "I knew you'd get here first," he said, stepping forward. "You were always the better bloodhound, but you don't know what you've found." Evelyn's voice was low, steady. "I know exactly what this is, and I know it doesn't belong to you." Cole's eyes flicked to the runestone, then to the gold spilling from the chest. "Do you think the world will thank you for hiding this? This could rewrite history, shift power, wealth." "That's exactly why it needs protecting," she cut in. "The people who left this behind wanted it kept safe, not stolen, not sold." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moaning through unseen cracks in the rock. Then Mara stepped between them, her stance firm. "If you want it, you'll have to go through all of us." Cole's smirk faltered. He glanced at the narrow cliff path behind him. One wrong move there could be fatal. Perhaps sensing he was outnumbered, he stepped back slowly, his voice hard. You're making a mistake. Maybe, Evelyn said, but it's the right one. They waited until his footsteps faded before sealing the stone door once more. Back on the beach, the wind had picked up, the sky shifting toward evening. Evelyn stood for a long moment, gazing at the cliffs. The rune stone now rested inside her waterproof satchel, wrapped in layers of cloth, the gold left untouched in its chamber. Weeks later, back at the archive, the manuscript sat once again in its padded folder, catalogued, preserved, and locked away. The coded route remained between its pages, invisible to all but those who knew how to see. Evelyn had filed no official report, only a vague notation about minor navigational annotations that would keep casual eyes from prying. Sometimes, late at night, she would trace the path in her mind, the empty seas, the jagged cliffs, the silent clearing. The place would remain what it had always been, a secret. The moral was clear, and it settled deep into her bones. Not every discovery was meant to be claimed. Some treasures existed to remind humanity of its limits and of the weight of trust passed down through time. She closed the archive's heavy doors for the night, the faint scent of salt and pine still lingering in her memory. If this story touched you, she thought, hearing the words in her own mind. Subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.